Welcome to the Father on Purpose podcast, featuring author and ministry leader Kent Evans and business executive and military veteran Lawson Brown. This is a show for you, Dad. You want to be a godly and intentional father. Unfortunately, you've turned to these two knuckleheads for help. Let us know how that works out for you. Before we begin, remember this: you are not a father on accident. So go be a father on purpose. Please welcome your hosts, Kent and Lawson.
It's good to see you, Kent. I'm
Lawson.
excited about this. Chapter 8 in Bring Your Hammer. The godly dad glorifies God and all he does. And I appreciate that you just prayed before we got started. I was in church yesterday, and the pastor he was a guest. He turned out to be fantastic. In the beginning, he goes, "Good to be here, blah, blah, blah. You know, I got a lot on my heart here, and I don't want this to be about me. So let me just open with some prayer. Dear Jesus, help. Amen." And then he got going. I was like,
That's awesome.
That's exactly what you need to do. You know, it was like, you don't need to draw it out. He knows. Just ask for it. Receive it.
That's awesome. That's awesome. The one word prayer. I love it. Love it.
Help.
That's what some dads listening to this podcast probably need to do today. They got some big family problem, whatever it is, marriage, kids, money, jobs, who knows, health. And maybe there's a dad listening today, and that's the word they needed to hear, is just Jesus, help.
Yeah. This chapter 8
man.
hit home with me. And, you know, Eric wrote this chapter, which was noticeably well written. As I was going through the book, I was like, I had to go back a few pages, like, oh, now I see why. It says by Eric. There you go.
I think I'm connecting the dots, Lawson. I'm picking up on what you're suggesting. If you're a first-time listener to this show, this will be Lawson's last episode. So let's wish him a great farewell.
No, this was good. And you know what? This story that he wrote about learning to drive, or being able to sit in his dad's lap and thinking that he was being allowed to drive as a young kid, resonated with me. It brought me right back to my grandfather's farm when I was like 10 years old. Couldn't reach the pedals, but he kind of taught me how to drive out there on the dirt road, and couldn't really hurt anything out in the middle of nowhere. But I remember distinctly that feeling of running in the house and feeling like, you know, I wanted to tell my grandmother or my mom or whoever, like, that I just drove. The way he describes it in his opening was really cool. You know, like, you could picture the little kid, hands on the steering wheel. The dad's doing everything, but the little boy or the little girl feels like they are the ones in control. And sometimes we as dads, you know, I'm guilty too, many times, of feeling like that was all me. This chapter about the godly dad glorifies God and all he does. How many times have I missed that point, thinking that it was all me, and God just, you know, looking down going, okay, well, let me let you actually grab the steering wheel for a few moments, and then I'll be right back. You'll see. You're rolling right off the road.
No question, man. Yeah, Eric Ballard, the co-author of our book, Bring Your Hammer, did a masterful job in this chapter. We split up the work. He did about 2/3 of the chapter writing. It's fun because I go back and read parts of the book and can really appreciate them in a different light, because I didn't write that section, you know, so It's like I can look at that story and really get blessed by it. So Eric, as I'm sure a faithful listener to this podcast, you're out there listening to this episode. Nice job, Eric, comparing that idea of, as a kid, feeling like you're in control. I've done that in my neighborhood before, where my youngest, Titus, who's now 7, but as he's been 5, 6, and 7, I'll occasionally ask him if he wants to go out and help me move the cars, and he'll sit in my lap and I'll let him steer a little bit. But in a neighborhood like mine, you know, there's cars everywhere and there's houses. And so you can't let him go very far. You know, that 5-year-old, he'll drive it up into a neighbor's yard. It's no joke.
Yeah.
It's no joke.
How many times in our lives have we felt like we were driving, and then you got to realize that God is in control, and it's a reassurance, you know, it's like, thankful he is the one with his hands on the wheel, that he never sleeps. He never takes his eyes off us. He's always in control. Although I appreciate that he lets us participate to a degree, and in that comes a lot of learning. One of the scripture that Eric put in the very beginning is Nehemiah 2:8. It says, "And because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my requests." Easy for me to say. Gosh, I stumbled through that. "And because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my request." That's the reason, because God's hand was on it. I wrote a note to myself that it doesn't say partly. It doesn't say, "and partly because the gracious hand of God was on me." Like, the reason is because God was doing this, was creating this.
Yeah, sometimes you just got to acknowledge the source. I remember that one of my very favorite sports quotes of all time is back in I think it was in the 80s or 90s, when Michael Jordan dropped 69 points in one game. And Stacey King had been subbed in for a bit and got fouled and made one free throw. And somebody asked Stacey King after the game, "What will you remember about tonight?" And he said, "I'll remember it as the night Michael Jordan and I combined for 70 points.
I had never heard that.
Oh my goodness. It's awesome. One of my very favorite sports quotes. And it's so funny. I mean, the more I say it, the funnier it gets year after year. And isn't that true, man? That's what we do, right? We score 1 point, God scores 69, and we walk around going, "Yeah, between me and God, 70."
That's so good.
And I love how Nehemiah, because there's a pretty powerful actor in this drama, right? The king. And the king had the earthly power, the ability to sign the law or commission the people or give a certain resource. So in some ways, the king's earthly power was real, not to be trifled with. He had the power of kind of life and death for the most part. And Nehemiah, I wouldn't have been shocked if Nehemiah had said, "Because the king gave me favor, my requests were granted." But
yeah, true. That's right.
It's not totally off base. When you go to somebody who has authority or power, yeah, in a sense, they have the ability to kind of give you the thumb up or the thumb down. But
yeah, that's a good thought.
Nehemiah knew for sure that God had paved the way, and that the reason the king was inclined was because God's favor was on him. I heard a Christian speaker one time, I think it was Alex Kendrick from the Kendrick Brothers films. He was at an event and he goes, "I don't know what all you need individually. Like, there's a bunch of people out in the audience, and I don't know what each one of you needs specifically, but I do know what all of you need generally. You need God's favor. You all need God's favor." And then he went on to just talk about how God's favor trumps my strategy, trumps my economic capacity, trumps my intelligence.
Yeah, I like that.
And just on and on. If God's hand is on us, we can't lose. We can't lose. And I think intently about that as a dad and as a husband, that if my marriage is going well and April and I are getting along well, and together we're like kind of back to back fighting the issues of the world around us, and we're not fighting each other. If my kids are making wise choices, if I have a good relationship with them in that season, all those aren't because, man, Kent did such a great job as a dad. It's because God's chosen to give us that favor. And right this second, that particular area of destruction or drama is not in our lives. And it's not just because of what we did, it's because of what he's actively doing in our lives.
I have found it hard to not want to try to be the hero. When things are going good, there have been some times where I've been really humbled, but I've also looked back and kind of like shook my head at myself when times were really good and have felt like I want to take the credit. I know a guy named Larry Brown who I always admired, because no matter what, whether it was things were going so great and everything just falling into place, it just looked natural and easy, or when things were really tough and he had hit a hard right turn or a roadblock in his life and something just really went off track, and regardless, his attitude was, God's got me right where he needs us, my family and I trust him. And I so admired the peace and the contentment and the wisdom that he portrayed. And no matter what the circumstance was, he just always deferred to the fact that in his heart that he knew that God had him and his family or him and his job or him and whatever, exactly where God wanted him to be. And I guess maybe there's a bit of growth that has come in my life because of men like him that have been able to model that attitude, that perspective, that mindset. But I have found that it's easier to give God the glory, AKA not try to take credit for something ourselves when it's like almost supernaturally clear that that was not of our doing. Like that's real easy when you go, well, yeah, they somehow healed, like they came out of the MRI and that thing was gone.
Right.
You don't go, well, that's because I, was able to get them here to the doctor's appointment on time. And, thankfully I was here to help with that. It was clearly God doing something.
Otherworldly.
Right. But as dads, when things are going well or when there is a struggle and we come out of it, the temptation to claim that heroic feat as something of our own.
You remind me of a story. A few years ago, our basement flooded. Like I would say again, it's not that it flooded all that often, but every couple of years it would flood. And my brother-in-law is a civil engineer. And so I was asking him, hey man, what can I do? And he's like, well, number one, go outside and grade the ground away from your house. Like I think you got a little swell there and water's coming up against your foundation. And he goes, and you should check that drain. There's an in-ground drain that's dug in our yard that he goes, you should check that. So I go out one day and it's like a bazillion degrees. I mean, I picked literally noon on a summer day to go do this. It was so stupid. But I go outside and I find out that the way they had done the drain originally, and I'm taking pictures, I'm texting them to my brother-in-law, and he's coaching me through the process. And there's 2 drains and they're not connected right. And so I go to Lowe's. Anyway, long story short, I repaired the ground outside my house with some help from my son and one of his friends. They were over one day. I had them doing some of the hard work. But then I dug this big, like 7-foot trench in my yard. And we got it all fixed. And then I could hardly wait until the first heavy rain just to see what would happen, right? There's a window on the side of my house where you can raise it up and you're protected from the rain. The rain doesn't come in because of the overhang of the roof, but you're like right above where that drain is in the ground. And so you can look at it like 5 feet in front of you. And I remember the first day it rained really hard and I rolled the window up and there was all this water flowing through that drain. I even went out in the rain to the ditch where the water exited and watched the water shoot out of this pipe. It was perfect. It was like a marvel of civil engineering, I'm sure. And what's funny is I was kind of standing there going, man, I totally fixed that. I completely fixed that. Like I tell water where to go. Water doesn't tell me where to go. I tell water where to go. And what's funny is, had I not had access to some young sturdy backs to help me move some dirt, had I not had access to a brother-in-law who's a civil engineer.
He's the guy, right?
Had I not had a shovel, had I not had a Lowe's nearby that I could drive to, none of that would have actually worked out good, right? It's something that simple that I forget. What's that age-old thing that says, if you see a turtle on the top of a mountain, you know one thing, he didn't get there by himself. And I didn't get there by myself. I didn't do that by myself. I love how my friend Jeff Kemp puts it. He's the first guy I've ever heard it to say it this way. He said, glory is man's kryptonite. Glory is man's kryptonite. And I love that phrase. It's the thing. It's this shiny, beautiful thing that has amazing power, but we are not to touch it. We are not to claim it. We're not to try to put it in our pocket. We don't get the glory. God
That's
gets
super
the glory.
cool.
And when we pull it closer to us, all we do is weaken ourselves. All we do when we pull glory toward ourselves is weaken ourselves. And I just love that idea. Jeff, good idea, man, on how to position that. So if you're a dad listening to this and you did that budget, or you arrested that guy, or you taught that class, or whatever you do on your day job, somehow you got the strength, you got the favor, you got the opportunity to do that. And if you go back far enough, it's not because of something you did. It's because of something that God has chosen to do through you.
So talk about that for just that one part about, like Superman, if kryptonite got near him, he got weaker. So when we try to take the glory for ourselves, we become weaker. Talk about that.
What's really interesting is I have a friend who has had a disproportionately successful business career. I don't know what he's worth, but I've stayed in at least 3 of his houses, one of which I know was worth several million bucks. And he's not overextended. I don't think this is for show. And so I think this guy has made a lot of money, a lot of money. And one time I asked him, I said, hey, man, what do you attribute your business success to? Like if there were like 1 or 2 kind of core things, what did you do right? And he goes, well, I can't get up in the morning and take a breath unless God says I can. And so all of it points back to God at some level. And then he kind of went on to say the second thing, which still wasn't, he didn't take credit for this. So step 1 is he said, God deserves the credit for even waking me up in the morning. Step 2, he said, I think everybody kind of comes out of the womb wired with a certain level of risk tolerance. Some people are real cautious and afraid. Some people are super big risk takers. He goes, and I just find most guys who have business success are on that sort of risk-taking half of the spectrum. They may not be all the way at the end and they're always betting the farm, but he goes, so I just came out kind of wired for risk. You've seen my successes and they've outnumbered my failures in terms of money, but I've had some colossal failures, but most people don't know those. And I just found it interesting that this guy's mindset for how he had achieved. Now, this is a guy who's brilliant with numbers, brilliant with people, brilliant with strategy, brilliant with real estate. Like this guy has amassed an incredible resume of skill. And most of the time in any room, he's the smartest guy in the room. But even so, his answer about how he achieved business success was step 1, God's got to wake me up every morning. Step 2, I had a default wiring and a DNA that made it. Yeah. He still hadn't gotten to the place where he goes, well, let me show you that spreadsheet I did, and I just found that an illuminating response where if we understand rightly what glory is, and that's like praiseworthy adulation, it never belongs with us. It never, ever belongs with us. Even if I sharpen that pencil, I'm looking on my desk here, even if I jump on the Zoom call at the right time, or I do the things I can do, it's because like I got a roof over my head. Well, who put the roof here? I don't even know, right? Because this house is 60 years old I live in or so. I don't even know who put the roof here, but somebody came out here and built this house that I can have Wi-Fi in and talk on my computer in. And all that combines over the decades that we're really standing on the shoulders of other people, and they couldn't have done that if they didn't have the strength to do it, and God gave them the strength. And so in the end, that's God cool. Gets the glory, not man.
Yeah.
Hey, Dad, do you wrestle with anger? Man, I sure have, and so have thousands of other dads in our email list. And so what we did for those dads and for you, we built a special digital course called The Anger-Free Dad. This digital course is chock full of almost 50 assets, a bunch of teaching videos, a ton of PDF booklets and worksheets, so you can walk through and understand your anger triggers, the expectations underneath, and how to pull those out of your heart and mind so you can be a dad who is less angry and more at peace. If you take this course and you do not become less angry, you will get all of your money back. Plus, we'll send you some boxing gloves so you can beat up the wall at your house with all of your mad anger. Dad, come take the Anger-Free Dad course today at manhoodjourney.org/anger-free-dad. That's manhoodjourney.org/anger-free-dad.
That's got to be a default stance in your mind. This is really good, man. I need to work on this. And another reason for it is because in the season of life that we're in right now with the girls and the family and new house and moving to Florida and all that, things are just really kind of clicking along. And I think you can model for your children a grateful heart so that they take that into their own lives. You call glory as a man's kryptonite, that shiny object, it's attractive. To avoid that, because as you try to intercept glory for yourself, you're doing a disservice to your faith, to your family. You're modeling this kind of the opposite attitude of gratitude for what's going on in your life. And, look, dude, I don't want my children or my wife to be dependent on me. Like, don't look at me because I'm going to fail. and I'm going to mess this up. I am not going to be successful where I need to be successful. But God never fails. He is always with us. He knows exactly what we need and when, and he knows what we don't.
Man.
And so, yeah, I'd much rather them know that I feel like and believe that I'm not the one doing this. And so be assured your life is not dependent on dad. Dad is going to mess this up at some point.
Yeah.
But God won't. And so let's all look to the goodness or the relief from a struggle or the upcoming, somehow God's going to get us out of this dark space. Let's rely on God for that, not this dad.
I even think about this, Lawson, in the context of like our spiritual gifts or even our skills, talents, abilities. So for example, one of my favorite verses in the Bible is 1 Peter 4:10. And I'm quoting it from memory. I didn't look it up before the show today, but it basically says, whatever gift you've been given,
right,
use that gift to serve other people. And it talks about bringing God's character, God's glory manifested into other people's lives. So it's like you're showing the grace of God as you use your gifts to serve other people.
Part of it is, how do we live in community as Christians with each other, right?
Yeah. And knowing our role in the body, right? So for example, I went to a public speaking class one time years ago, maybe 15 years ago. And the teacher, Charles, was this super seasoned veteran. He had trained all kinds of people, media people, senators. Like, this dude was A-list public speaking trainer. One of the things that he insisted is that you understand your strengths or weaknesses as a presenter. And his point was, most of us understand our weaknesses all too well and don't understand our strengths at all. And so what he made you do as part of the training was, and a dad could do this as he's driving down the road, or if you're working out right now, or you're going for a run, you can do this with me. So Charles had this exercise where he would say, all right, stand up. And for a couple of minutes, I want you to tell us 3 or 4 things about you that are true. And then he went on to say, these should be like character traits. These are character traits, not like I grew up in Louisville. These are character traits. Tell something about you. And so when it came to be my turn, there was about a dozen of us in the class. I said something like, well, people tell me I'm kind of, and I've heard people say that I'm sort of, and then there's one time I was kind of like this, and I had all these qualifiers around my character traits. And Charles goes, okay, Kent, that was okay. Now let's try it again. And I don't want you to use any qualifiers at all. And he said, so you said people have said you're sometimes, maybe sort of funny. He goes, here's the question. Are you funny? And it's like this kind of tense moment in the speaking class where he's looking right at me. He goes, are you funny? And I said, well, I mean, he goes, what?
Right.
He goes, are you funny? And I caught on finally, right? And I go, yes, absolutely. I'm hilarious. And then he started laughing and he goes, see what I mean? And so he made us do it again. But here's what's really interesting. I think people confuse in this area of glory and God's favor and how God's wired us and gifted us. We confuse being able to state how God has wired us for taking the credit. So for example,
I see what you're saying. Right.
I can think and be quick on my feet. Mm-hmm. I can think and how I can be thinking quick on my feet? God gave me that ability.
Right.
I'm funny. You know why? Because God gave me the ability to use humor. I can write. I'm not a bad writer. I might even be a good writer. Who knows? But I'm close. I'm writing. So those things I want dads to hear. You acknowledging your gifts and your strengths is not the same thing as you taking credit for them. Unless you take credit for them. Unless you decide, well, the reason I'm such a good business person is because I understand math forward and backward, and I know everything, and on we go. I would love to have dads walk away from today's episode knowing that a couple things are true. One is glory is not something we reach for. Credit is something we give God, and our gifts are something he gives us in order to use those gifts to help other people. So part of the exploration for us. Yeah, man,
very well said.
Part of the exploration is if I walk into a room and they're all trying to do brain surgery best thing I can do is like go get the surgeon a glass of water. Right. I mean, like that's
right.
That's probably, and leave the room and not come back until the surgery is over. Like that's a room in which I can add almost no value, and all I can add is risk and damage. You know, I'm just going to touch something with a germ and all of a sudden the patient dies. That's not a room where I can add value. But if it's a room where they're trying to figure out like how to put a talk together or how to do marketing or how to, you know, write something, all of a sudden I become useful in that setting. It's not because I'm arrogant. It's not because I'm boastful. It's because I know how God's gifted me. And I also know how he hasn't gifted me. There are a number of areas, most rooms I can't be helpful in. There's way more rooms I can't be helpful in than there are rooms I can be helpful in.
Right.
I just think we got to figure that out over time, man. And we've got to, as dads, help our kids figure that out. How have you helped your daughters, Lawson, on that journey? You've got at least one daughter who's talented up front and does stage kind of stuff. I'm sure over the course of her teenage and adolescent years, she was experimenting with that skill, the ability to sing or entertain or be up front or act. And I don't know your other daughter's story as well, but like, how have you encouraged your daughters to discover their gifts, but at the same time, not become arrogant or boastful about them?
You know, it's always been part of the conversation where it's a God-given talent. Olivia can dance like nobody's business. Abigail's got this beautiful voice. And that's been part of the conversation. But I always feel like I'm coming across as this guy that's got it figured out. And I do not and did not. But also try to weave in like, God's really given you the gift of empathy. Forget about being able to sing well or talent. And we did talk about that being something that God put in them. And God's really given you a mind for independence in Olivia's case, as far as like, I think she's going to be an entrepreneur, that kind of thing. It's a nice way of saying she probably ain't going to work for someone very well.
Hardcore unemployable.
I'm teasing.
Hardcore unemployable.
She's a good worker. So not necessarily the talent specific question, but the character and the who you are. And what does God have in store for us that he's preparing your heart to undertake down the road? Or we've talked about things in our marriage because we've moved around a little bit here and there. Kind of like, what does God have in store for us? What's he preparing us for as a family? But I think what you said, man, that really, really resonated. And I hope it encourages dads out there where accepting and believing that God gifted you for something is not taking credit for something that God has done or is doing in your life or in the life of someone in your family. Let's avoid trying to steal the credit or intercept that glory and be much more quickly ready to deflect or reflect that glory and that credit back to the source.
Man, the verse I wanted to, doesn't have to be the very last thing we say, but let's talk a little bit about this verse, Lawson, as we hit the back end of this podcast episode. If you have a minute, Dad, and you are where you can grab your Bible, go grab your Bible and turn to chapter 8 of the book of Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy chapter 8. I'm going to read just a few verses. I'm going to read them here on the podcast. But I think if you look through this, it's a really great 3-verse stretch or 4-verse stretch where if you look for the verbs and you look for the action words, it really crystallizes what we're talking about on this episode. So in verse 15, it says, Moses talking about the deliverance of Israel, and he's talking about God. And he says, he led you. So notice who's doing the leading. He led you through the vast and dreadful wilderness, thirsty and waterless land with snakes and scorpions. Then it goes on to say, he brought you water out of hard rock. He gave you manna to eat in the wilderness, something your ancestors hadn't even known, to humble and test you so that in the end it might go well with you. You may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth. It goes on and says a lot more other things, but I just want to take that stretch and like God did the leading. God brought the water. God gave them food to eat. And the intent there, it says, so that in the end, it might go well with you, so that you would be humbled and tested. But remember, and you're going to be tempted to say, look at what I did. Look at what I've done.
Right.
But remember the Lord your God, for it's he who gives you the ability to produce wealth. And I just think that verse to me reminds me, if I can continually have this posture of not having the glory, seeing that when things go well for me, it is God's hand. It is God's hand in my life. And even amidst those things, if you go back and look at that story of Israel, some things, they were not easy. It wasn't necessarily easy to live in the wilderness. It wasn't necessarily easy to make that journey, but they were provided for. They were provided for all along the way. And even then, they're going to be tempted to take credit.
Yep.
But man, they can't do that, right, Lawson?
I love where scripture completely lacks ambiguity. Like there's nowhere in there where it was like, look, God and us together are going to figure this out. Or God gave some way out, but you also had a part in this. And, you guys figured out how to get water. And that whole thing is just completely describes everything that happens to take care of them, to get them out, was because of the power and the strength that God had. And to avoid credit as if it's kryptonite is something that I'm taking away from this. And not because it diminishes God, because it doesn't, because he is the all-powerful, almighty. He's everything. Nothing can diminish him. But in my life, I want to be dependent on him. I don't want to be dependent on me. I don't want to seek glory for myself, because what that does is it's putting myself in a position of being in charge and being in control, and I don't want to be. If it really boils down to, like, does Lawson Brown need to be in charge of everything in his life and in his family's life and our safety and our finances and our skills and our talents? Absolutely not. None of us do. If I had the choice, would I rather God be in control of all that and get all the glory for that? So I'm going to reflect that glory, and I'm going to avoid credit like it's kryptonite.
I'll close with a quick story, and that is when we went to adopt our boys from Ethiopia. I remember just being completely at the mercy of our in-country liaison for the adoption. Number one, he knew the system. He knew what was going on. He knew the steps. Number two, he knew the language. Number three, he knew the geography. Number four, he knew the danger spots, et cetera, right? And all I could basically do was get on an airplane and land myself in the country. That was my job. From the moment I landed at that airport till the moment I got back to that airport and he put me in the door, I was at his mercy. I was completely dependent on him. And in one of the cases, some government system went down and some technological thing, and we were there 2 weeks longer than we should have been. And every day he'd come over to the hotel and I would say, is the thing back up? And he would go, no, not yet. So then we were both at the mercy of, like, the internet that didn't work or whatever the problem was. And I just remember thinking, man, sometimes to do God's will, which we firmly believe those two adoptions were in his will for us, sometimes to do God's will, you got to put yourself in a position where you're completely dependent on him and other people. And that for me is a picture of being dropped into a place where I don't know the language, I don't know the customs, I don't know the process. I couldn't have driven myself anywhere in that country. I didn't have a car, much less I didn't know where the roads were. All that to say, some dads need to hear this message that they are holding on so white-knuckled to their family. They're trying so hard to control their children.
Yeah. Awful. It's so stressful. It's so hard.
Oh, my goodness. And I see occasionally, this is of course true about me. No question. It's true about me, where I try to control the outcome of every decision my children make. I'm just now to the point where out of my 5 kids, more of them are legal adults than not. For this just changed about a month ago. As my middle son hit 18, I have more kids who are legal adults, 3, and then I have 2 that are not, plus a daughter-in-law. So I have 4 on one side, 2 on the other. And I'm realizing as the older they get, the more that I can't control every decision that they make. And I don't even want to become like the critic who points out the ones I think they got wrong. I want to be the encourager, and I want to be the one who points them to God. And even when they start to take credit, they're like, look, I aced that test. I'm so smart. I occasionally want to go, yeah, let's remember where we got that big brain from. I want to be the guy who helps point them back to the fact that they don't need to take the glory. They don't need to be in control. God takes the glory. God gets all the glory. And in the end, it's him. It's him who's in charge. And Nehemiah knew that. Dad, I hope you know that. I know Lawson knows that. I'm trying to learn that. So I hope today's conversation has helped you get just an inch closer to realizing what we really need is we need the hand of God and his favor on our life. That's what we need.
Right
and
on.
let's give God the credit for that and rejoice in the fact that we don't have to be in charge.
Thank goodness.
We can just go along for the ride and use our gifts to bless other people. Lawson, thanks for the conversation today, brother. It's been enlightening and invigorating as always.
Thanks. You too, Kent. Take care.
Hey, Dad, thank you for listening to today's show. If you found this episode helpful, remember, you can get all the content and show notes at manhoodjourney.org/podcast. And if you really liked it, please consider doing 3 things. Number 1, share this podcast with someone. You can hit the share button in your app, wherever you listen to podcasts, or just call a person up and tell them to listen in. Number 2, subscribe to this podcast so you get episodes automatically. That helps us as well to help dads find the show. You can do that through your favorite listening app, whatever that is. And finally, review this podcast. Leave us a review, good or bad, wherever you listen. Those reviews also help other dads find the show. You can always learn more about what we're up to at manhoodjourney.org or fatheronpurpose.org. We will see you next week.
You've been dozing off to the Father on Purpose podcast featuring Kent Evans and Lawson Brown. Now, wake up. Head over to fatheronpurpose.org for more tools that can help you be a godly, intentional, and not completely horrible dad. Remember, you are not a father on accident, so go be a father on purpose.